I'd like to share with you the story of a mind-altering parasite that has a particular relationship with one of these groups of feliform carnivorans. To introduce this, though, let's just take a step back and find Feliformia on our placental mammal tree of life, and they are here in the carnivora, of course, which, as you've already heard, are part of the Lorasiatheria on the placental mammal tree of life. And feliforms are the sister group to caniforms, so all living carnivorans are in one of those two groups. Feliforms include animals like hyenas and meerkats and genets, and this really wonderful radiation of endemic Malagasy feliforms, things like a Cryptoprocta. Nandinia is not pictured, that's a two-spotted palm civet, and of course the felids themselves, things like lions and tigers, and here is an Iberian lynx. The mind-altering parasite I'm going to tell you about has a particular relationship with felids. Felids are unlike other mammals and other carnivores in the sense that they are more dependent on muscle tissue for their nutrition. They really require muscle tissue to get nutrients such as taurine and vitamin A and vitamin B. So you really have to provide supplements to your cat if, as some people apparently do, if you want to feed them a vegetarian diet. They really can't get taurine from plant-based sources, unlike most other species. And those of you who remember the specimens that you've seen in the den will recall that a canid has really effective tribosphenic occlusion. They have upper molars with a prominent protocone that occludes in a very nice talonid basin of the lower M1. Cats don't have that. They don't have the ability to masticate posterior to their carnassials in the same way that a canid does. So they're very dependent on muscle tissue for their nutrition. Now, felids have a long history on most of the world's continent. Of course, the native populations of cats are their top predators, and they never existed in anywhere near the densities that modern domesticated cat populations have. And that's, of course, a direct result of the fact that we feed these cats. Humans like cats. They are beautiful animals, and we keep them in densities the Earth has never seen before. And so this has a lot of negative consequences for not just species besides felids, but even for other felids themselves. So this interesting paper from Laus et al. In 2013 described a case where several Florida panthers died from a feline leukemia virus that had been introduced by a population of feral cats. There are other carnivorans like otters. This is a caniform carnivoran that were negatively influenced by a similar kind of parasite that was introduced by populations of feral cats. And then you have the more obvious cases of direct killing that domesticated and feral cats will inflict on local populations of marsupials and, of course, birds as well. Even birds that you might think are very common, like a blackbird in Europe or Britain, following Laus et al. These too have a very substantial level of mortality due to feral populations of cats. And it's worth reading one of the conclusions of Laus et al., namely that, and I quote, free-ranging cats cause substantially greater wildlife mortality than previously thought and are likely to be the single greatest source of anthropogenic mortality for U.S. birds and mammals. Making the situation worse is the fact that cat owners tend not to be aware of the damage that their pets can inflict. So here are the results of a survey that McDonald et al. Undertook and published in 2015 in Ecology and Evolution of cat owners in two English towns, one Mon and Smith, the other Thornhill. And on the y-axis reflects the amount of damage that owners said their cats caused to local avifauna and other vertebrates, and the damage that they actually inflicted based on the techniques that McDonald et al. In their paper describe. And as you see, there's no correlation. This is a correlation coefficient. This is a p-value. It is not significant. So the owners had certain ideas about what their cats were doing, but the reality was, generally speaking, quite different. And so McDonald et al. Concluded in their paper that cat owners failed to perceive the magnitude of their cats' impacts on wildlife and were not influenced by ecological information. This is a very sobering video that all of you should watch. a really nice journalistic outfit by the name of Vice that maybe you've heard of, filmed this a few years back, Shooting Cats, Australia's War on Feral Cats. There's the link. I'll copy it into the comments of this video, and I highly recommend that everyone watch this video. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it's definitely worth a look. And it's worth just quoting from the title page, perhaps as you've read already, feral cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 28 Australian mammals and continue to wreak havoc. Now, I don't blame you if you get the impression that I hate cats. I really don't, honestly. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I love native species, including felids, which have a history of millions of years on almost all the world's continents. And out of fairness, I want to point out that the problem is with invasive species in general, in particular humans. We are the ones responsible for this. We are the ones bringing cats to every corner of the world and not paying attention as they, thanks to us, wreak havoc. And I wanted to just give due credit to one of my colleagues at the Zoology Museum, Mike Brook, who is an ornithologist who spent his career going to some of these remote islands in various parts of the world and trying to make a difference and making a difference in terms of eliminating invasive species. And of course, he's not just focused on cats. And I've put here on this slide a few quotes from his Brook et al. Study published in 2017, pointing out that when you eradicate most or at least multiple invasive species, then the recovery of the natives is greatly helped, right? So one of his conclusions is that the current best practice is reinforced by our study, namely the removal of all invasive species whenever this is feasible. So he's talking about everything from goats to rodents and cats as well, of course. Now, having said that, there is something special about cats, and this is where I'm slowly making my way towards this idea of the mind-altering parasite. And I want to introduce this mind-altering parasite via a plan that the City Council in Auckland, New Zealand had for at least a while approved, which had to do with culling populations of feral cats in and around the city of Auckland. And this is an image of a local businessman, a guy by the name of Gareth Morgan, who's been involved in some of these efforts to cull cat populations because he really cares about his local bird fauna and herpetofauna. In the case of New Zealand, and then in Australia, there's lots of endemic marsupials that could be saved if we were to reduce the populations of feral cats. And so in this interview, I put the link on the slide. In this interview, he says something quite interesting regarding his efforts to firstly encourage the Auckland Council to move ahead with their cat cull plan, and he's also had some of his own efforts towards that end. One of his quotes that I think is worth reading is this one here. "I don't think I've ever had as much hate mail and death threats on any topic as I have on domestic cats," says Gareth Morgan. "What is it about cats that drives people nuts?" End quote. The answer to that question is a apicomplexan parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. Now, apicomplexa is the name of a clade. It's a group of single-celled parasites. Another member of that clade is the malaria parasite, Plasmodium. Toxoplasma can reproduce clonally in just about any kind of animal. However, it needs the gut of a cat to reproduce sexually. And so one of the amazing details about Toxoplasma that's emerged over the last couple decades is its ability to manipulate the behavior of its hosts. So here's a study by Vyas et al. In 2007, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, in which they documented the ways in which this apicomplexan parasite Toxoplasma manipulates the behavior of rodent hosts. In this case, it's blocking the innate aversion of rats for cat urine, and instead of an aversion, these Toxoplasma-infected rats are actually attracted to cat urine. And if you don't believe me, click on some of these videos, one from the BBC, another from CBS, in which you can watch rats that just can't get enough of a local kitty cat. Now, it's not just rats and mice that Toxoplasma can affect, but rather it's humans as well. And I want to cite the some of the work of this parasitologist from Charles University in the Czech Republic, Jaroslav Fleger, who wrote a paper published in 2007 in Schizophrenia Bulletin called The Effects of Toxoplasma on Human Behavior. And I just want to read to you a little bit from what that paper contained. So, latent infection with Toxoplasma is among the most prevalent of human infections, and it has generally been assumed that except for congenital transmission, it is asymptomatic. But the demonstration that latent Toxoplasma can alter behavior in rodents has led to a reconsideration of this assumption. And what he concluded in that paper was that when infected human adults were compared with uninfected adults on personality questionnaires, several differences were found. It's rather ominous. So what were these differences? Well, Fleger goes on to describe increased levels of suspicion, decreased levels of self-control, decreased psychomotor performance. So here's the paper itself if you wanted to look into that in more detail. This is, of course, a far cry from full-blown toxoplasmosis, which is, of course, what the medical community has long recognized as a potentially fatal disease that humans can suffer from. And that's why every bag of kitty litter at the supermarket comes with a warning for pregnant women not to handle cat feces. Because a fetus inside the womb of a human female doesn't have a fully functional immune system and could be particularly susceptible to the action of a Toxoplasma parasite. But the medical community has generally assumed, as Fleger pointed out, that Toxoplasma, in healthy adults is pretty benign. And I think we should be worried that maybe that assumption is not quite as solid as we've thought. But regardless of your feelings about Fleger's work on these arguably minor differences in psychology, there is a very well documented link between Toxoplasma and schizophrenia. And one of the papers I'd like to point out backing this claim up is by Jochen et al., writing in Parasite Immunology in a paper in 2009. Jochen et al. Point out a number of things. Firstly, that and I quote, some individuals with adult toxoplasmosis develop psychotic symptoms similar to those in schizophrenia. The antipsychotic drugs known to be effective in schizophrenia also inhibit parasites such as Toxoplasma. And then finally, studies have shown that individuals with schizophrenia compared to controls have had greater exposure to cats in childhood. So again, cats are part of our feliform radiation. They are deserving of no less appreciation and respect as any other part of this mammalian radiation. But in the quantities that humans have them in our cities and indeed outside of cities all throughout the world, they have a hugely negative influence on other species, partly because of their necessity to thrive on muscle tissue and not to be able to switch to a more omnivorous diet, unlike other carnivores. Combine that with their contribution to substantial mortality and even extinction of other species, even in areas where felids are native. Of course, they do that because the numbers in which humans keep cats are so massive compared to where a normal top predator would be in terms of the ratio of predator to prey. That really spells some damage, and especially when you take into consideration that here we have a documented relationship between a parasite that is particularly fond of cats, and that parasite can manipulate the behavior of its hosts in order to favor cats because it wants to get back into the gut of a cat. The take-home message of all of that is really, if you must own a cat, please have it neutered and keep it indoors.